Well, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. It is real.
Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and tell y'all this, that Dodge has never exactly gotten it right. They've always gotten a few things right, but they never quite got it right. What do I mean by it? The compact segment. You see, back in the early 1990s and the early 2000s, Dodge was going through a bit of an identity crisis. I know we throw that out there, but that's what it was. And they used to produce products such as the Avenger, the Neon, and simultaneously the Intrepid. Fast forward into 2005, 2006, we would get the unveiling of the Dodge Charger, and it would seem that the struggle for Dodge would be over. Howsoever, shortly thereafter, the housing crisis kind of ruined any intentions that Dodge had, and thus they were acquired by Cerberus, which was basically a private equity firm. Shortly thereafter, Cerberus discovered that it wasn't exactly a good idea to acquire the Chrysler brand, as they realized it was basically hemorrhaging money. Then later on, it would be acquired by FCA, and FCA wanted to make it a point to not only use Chrysler as a stamp of revival, but more importantly as an entry into the American market. And in 2013, the Dodge Dart would be unveiled. Now, at the time of its debut, the Dodge Dart was incredibly promising, as it was supposed to be an alternative to the Chevy Cruze as well as the Ford Focus, a spicier, more performance-oriented compact sedan, as that segment had been slowly dying in lieu of subcompact to compact SUVs. And so in this video, I wanted to kind of give you guys a glimpse of why the Dodge Dart not only did not succeed, but why it was never designed to succeed in the first place. With that being said, stick around and stay tuned, because you are now watching The Breakdown. Okay, so let's get into it. So, of course, you know, with the Dodge Dart, we all know about the recent model from 2013, but I kind of want to give you guys a little bit of context historically to give you an idea of how we got here. So, let's go ahead and rewind to that so we can get into that. So, the Dodge Dart originally began its journey back in 1963, and it was supposed to be called the Zip, apparently, and Dodge said, ew. And so, that was actually dropped, and last minute, the Dodge Dart name was kept. Now, the Dodge Dart, when it was initially introduced, it was supposed to be closer to one of the replacements for one of the Plymouth models. And so Dodge decided that they were going to make this a full-size vehicle initially, but 1 year after, they would eventually go back and look at the drawing board and say, we probably need to shrink this a little bit, and basically make the people pay a little bit more for a little bit less. But that's besides the point. So you could get this in either station wagon, coupe, or convertible, and the Dodge Dart was a smash hit when it was on the market. Of course, one of the big things to note is that you could get this also with two engine choice, which was the 2.8 or the 3.7, and of course the 3.7 liter had a lot more to it, if you will. Nonetheless, the Dodge Dart was supposed to be one of those cars that you knew you were getting a lot of value, and it was supposed to appeal to a lot of younger buyers, as we all know since today that many of us can't really afford anything. And so, especially back in the early 60s, it was a flourishing period for young people as they were entering the working market. And so, as a promising adult, a lot of them decided that they wanted to move towards the Dodge Dart and many other cars that were out at the time, because it was just the thing to do. Fast forward into 1973, and we hit the historical gas crisis of 1973. And of course, shortly thereafter, 3 years later, by no coincidence, was the Dodge Dart discontinued. One of the problems with the Dodge Dart initially was that not only was it a mid-sized car, but more importantly, the Japanese had come in and taken everybody by storm, because a lot of consumers were moving towards compact front-wheel drive sedans, and unfortunately, the Americans took too long to adjust. See the malaise era. And so towards the mid 80s to 90s, you would see a lot of American car companies really struggle to gain the eye of consumers. Of course, we all know about the Chevy Cavalier, we know about the Ford Escort, and one of the more successful models for Dodge at the time was the Dodge Colt, but the Dodge Colt would be shortly discontinued, even though it was highly successful and highly sought after. Dodge really would not have anything, and even Chrysler, of course, we know about the K cars, and that whole period was just a mess. But one of the smash hits that came out of this frumpy era for Dodge would be the Neon. Technically, the Neon is not the predecessor to the Dodge Dart, even though it is by layman's terms, but that's only because it was not under the property of FCA, which I'll get to in a minute. So the Dodge Neon, love it, absolutely loved it. It was cheap, it was affordable, and people knew what we were getting. Like, there was no frills, no thrills, but we knew that.
Taylor Swift.
Okay, great gowns, beautiful gowns.
Shortly thereafter, you would also get the SRT4 version of the Dodge Neon in its second generation towards the facelift. And the Dodge Neon was quite successful. Between the era of Daimler Chrysler, Dodge, Chrysler, and Jeep saw some really good times. It was a hoot. You had to be there. But towards 2006, unfortunately, Daimler-Benz would decide they would divorce Chrysler as a result of different management styles and culture fits and yada, 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 corporate jargon. Ugh. But the real issue that arrived was, where was Chrysler going to call home? Now, they were acquired by Cerebras Capital towards 2007 to 2009, and that proved to be quite a problem for Cerebras because Chrysler, nobody was going to tell them that basically they were unprofitable. Of the big three, General Motors and Ford have always seemed to be on the better tail end of things, even though they've had their own problems. But Chrysler was never the successful banger since the K cars of the 80s. And you know, Chrysler, I'll get into that in another video. But the thing is that towards the divorce of the Daimler Chrysler era and the Cerebras Capital acquisition, Chrysler was changing hands quite a few times. Towards the housing crisis of 2008, which would arise, Cerebras would eventually sell off the shares to Chrysler to be able to recoup some things. And now Chrysler was looking for somewhere to call home once again. In comes Fiat. Now, Fiat is an Italian company, and they left the US market a while back prior to getting back with Chrysler. And part of the benefit of this merger that they bought Chrysler for was to be able to re-enter some cars into the American market, which is why you begin to see more Fiat 500s come in closer towards the early 2000s as a result of this merger. So the acquisition between Chrysler and Fiat took about 5 years. That was from 2009 to 2014, and it cost them a total of $5.5 billion to acquire them in full. And this was a great plot device by Fiat because basically they wanted to be able to re-enter to the market, but also with less risk, and Chrysler was the perfect brand to do it. Now, how does this tie into everything? Well, the first true product from FCA towards 2013 would be the Dodge Dart. Now, getting into it. Historical things aside, there were a few things that were wrong with the Dodge Dart. You see, the Dodge Dart was a departure from what it initially was back in the early 1960s, and partly that was because companies like to do this thing where they bring back old nameplates because they prey on nostalgia. Apparently, nostalgia is a very powerful drug. But in order to get the people going for the new compact sedan, as Chrysler had not had one for years since the Caliber, which we don't even really discuss that much, you had to be there. But the thing is that the Chrysler brand really needed a compact segment, especially since many of their products have been dissolved as a result of unprofitability. The Dodge Dart at its debut was supposed to be a really good time, and it was quite the opposite. At its initial launch, the Dodge Dart came with 3 different engine choices, which was a 2-liter naturally aspirated engine. There was also a 1.4 Fiat designed turbocharged engine, and there was also a 2.4 liter Tiger Shark engine, which was supposed to give you 185 horsepower. But both the 1.4 and the 2-liter gave you 160 horsepower, which could be had in either a manual transmission or could be had in a dual clutch or a traditional 6-speed automatic. And apparently the dual clutch transmission was also a dry clutch, which I don't know why many other manufacturers are doing dry clutch, as Ford did that, and we see where it got them. But the thing is that in time of the Dodge Dart, it was supposed to be the answer to the Ford Focus and the Chevy Cruze, which of course after the housing crisis 2008, many people were looking for more affordable cars, as many of them had traded in their SUVs. And Fiat alongside Chrysler thought it would be a great idea to introduce a front-wheel drive compact sedan. In terms of styling, you could see a lot of Italian elements infused in this car. Nothing about this Dodge Dart was American. While it was American branded, the influences in the styling and even the interior design, you can see a lot of different shapes that don't necessarily reflect the rigidness, ruggedness, or durability and cheapness of the American brand. In addition, there was also a lot of strange plastics that were inside this car. And the Dodge Dart, while it was stylish because it looked a lot better than the Ford Focus and Chevy Cruze, was not exactly up to par in performance. The Dodge Dart, unfortunately, would not be the performance model it was supposed to reign after setting the tone for a lot of Dodge brands, especially when you've got the big brother like the Dodge Charger and Challenger doing absolute crazy numbers. And of course, because of that, it made it that much harder for a lot of Americans to really identify with the Dodge Dart, because it just did not give the same je ne sais quoi that a lot of us were accustomed to. In terms of performance, the Dodge Dart was slow. It was slow as you see, the Dodge Dart on average could get you 0 to 60 from anywhere between 8 seconds and 9 seconds flat, and that was with the more potent engines coming out of the 2.4 liter turbocharged. Now, getting into it, from 2013 to 2016, the Dodge Dart had a total sales of 334,000 units. That is probably a fraction of what not only the Toyota and Honda Civic do, but it probably didn't even beat out the Nissan Sentra, and God knows people hate that car, but it does very well in sales. And by comparison, the Ford Focus and Chevy Cruze respectively sold 2.8 million and 1.8 million cars worldwide, and so it was very evident that this was simply not comparative. The Dodge Dart in its entire run of sales essentially only did 7%. Sales wise, we're trying to identify why it didn't sell. Well, it was never meant to be successful. So the first problem that Dodge really ran into was giving a nostalgic name without the performance behind it. Even though the Dodge Dart from a pricing standpoint was in line with its lineage of $16,000 MSRP, it did not compare in terms of performance, whereas you had things such as the Ford Focus and the Chevy Cruze giving you a lot more bang for your buck. The other thing is that it was very uncompetitive. In that segment of compact, while it is not always the thing to have the most fire-breathing engine coming out the exhaust pipes, but it is an important thing to know that these cars have to be efficient and also value packed. And the slowness behind this car really could not be emphasized, as it really was a dog to drive. And anytime you have a Dodge car, it is always expected to have this higher level of performance aspects to it, because that's what the Dodge brothers wanted. The other thing is that the Dodge Dart, as a guinea pig for the new FCA lineup, there also was a parts bin of issues that happened with the Dodge Dart. There was a lot of recalls on this car. In its first year in debut, the Dodge Dart had a total of 1,220 complaints. There was a recall back in 2013 that affected stalling, and over 12,500 units with the 1.4 liter Fiat style engine were quickly recalled, and later 23,000 units were recalled for a faulty transmission. By November 2015, there will also be an additional 105,000 units that fell under recall with the leaking engine oil. This car is garbage. And so part of that is because there were a lot of parts that weren't truly engineered, and it was a parts bin and branded as an American car, but it was not built like one. And I know that sounds crazy, but it wasn't built like an American car. And finally, even after discontinuation towards 2016, there was another recall for 2019, and that was because the 6-speed automatic transmission could fail. This car couldn't catch a fucking brake. And so basically, owners would say that the car would suddenly stop and fail to restart, and require multiple trips to the dealership over time. There aren't many on the road, and that is because simply Dodge did not sell a lot of them. But more importantly, the last reason why this was never meant to succeed is because of the timing. During the time of the earlier Dart back in the 60s, it was a thing to have a small sedan or a little fun car that really you could rip the road with, that wouldn't cost you too much money, as sedans were a huge part of the American consumer market. How so in the ever? Towards the early 90s and 2000s, we begin to see a lot of crossovers and SUVs. Chrysler as a whole would be changing hands so many times that they really couldn't get their foot in engineering and development down before pushing out a new product. And of course, because they weren't exactly successful, a lot of companies that took over the brand really didn't want to pump too much money into a model that wasn't going to work. And unfortunately, the Dodge Dart was a product of that, because of all the issues and changeovers that Dodge had not only dealt with, but also the popularity of SUVs continued to rise, creating even more of a problem. In addition to all of those things, it just simply was not a good manufactured formula. And unfortunately, towards 2016, next to the Chrysler 200, they would both be discontinued because they simply could not find a supplier who was willing to do it, and that wouldn't cost Dodge an arm and a leg. But you guys let me know in the comment section what you think about the Dodge Dart. If you think it was supposed to be successful at its initial debut, if you think it was supposed to be successful during its time run, or if you feel like people just wasn't fucking with it. And with that being said, until the next episode, I will see you guys later.